Episode 1 Prelude to Conflict. Welcome to our video series, where we will delve into the depths of the Ukraine-Russia war, examining its complexities and consequences. This is Episode 1 on the Ukraine and Russia war. In this episode we will discuss about the both countries' history, relations, etc. Explore the tensions, underlying factors, and events that led to the outbreak of war. Introduction to countries. Ukraine, a majestic nation nestled in Eastern Europe, proudly holds the distinction of being the second largest country on the entire continent, surpassed only by its colossal neighbor, Russia. Within its borders lies a captivating capital, Kyiv, gracefully positioned along the banks of the mighty Dnieper River, at the heart of north-central Ukraine. The head of government in Ukraine is the Prime Minister, currently Denis Shmyhal. The head of state is the President, currently Volodymyr Zelensky. The population of Ukraine is approximately 43,131,000. Ukraine's journey towards full independence in the late 20th century was marked by a tumultuous history, shaped by successive periods of domination. The land that is now Ukraine experienced various ruling powers, including Poland, Lithuania, Russia, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. Although Ukraine briefly tasted independence from 1918 to 1920, parts of its western territories fell under the control of Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia between the two world wars. Eventually, Ukraine became a constituent part of the Soviet Union as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, SSR. However, as the winds of change swept through the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, Ukraine seized the opportunity to assert its sovereignty. The legislature of the Ukrainian SSR declared its autonomy on July 16, 1990, and later proclaimed full independence on August 24, 1991. This declaration of independence was ratified by the Ukrainian people through a popular vote on December 1, 1991. With the dissolution of the USSR later that year, Ukraine emerged as a fully independent nation. The country officially adopted the name Ukraine and played a significant role in establishing the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, a union comprising former Soviet republics. Ukraine's path to independence is a testament to the resilience and determination of its people, who embraced the opportunity to shape their own destiny amidst a changing geopolitical landscape. Now let's talk about Russia. Russia, a land of grandeur and complexity, has a rich history marked by triumphs, challenges, and pivotal moments that have shaped its global standing. Russia, a sprawling nation that stretches across the vast expanse of Eastern Europe and Northern Asia, bears witness to a remarkable historical trajectory. Once the dominant republic within the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, famously known as the Soviet Union, Russia embarked on a transformative journey towards independence following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991. This pivotal moment marked the beginning of a new chapter in Russia's history as it emerged as a sovereign nation, charting its own course on the global map. Russia, with its capital in Moscow, boasts a population of 144,995,000, 2023 est. The currency exchange rate is approximately $1 to 90.431 Russian ruble. Mikhail Mishustin serves as the Prime Minister, while Vladimir Putin holds the position of President, leading the government and representing the state. This dynamic nation combines vast dimensions, a rich population, and a stable leadership. Russia, a realm of awe-inspiring magnificence, holds a prominent place among nations. Its vastness surpasses all others, spanning nearly double the territory of Canada, the second largest country. Stretching across northern Asia and Eastern Europe, Russia embraces 11 time zones, encompassing diverse landscapes from arid deserts to sweeping steppes, dense forests, and Arctic tundra. Within its borders lie natural wonders such as Europe's longest river, the Volga, and largest lake, Ladoga. Russia proudly claims the world's deepest lake, Baikal, and has recorded astonishingly low temperatures rivaling the poles. Russia, a land of remarkable diversity, encompasses a mosaic of peoples and cultures. While the majority are ethnic Russians, the country is also home to over 120 other ethnic groups, each with their own languages, religions, and customs. The population is predominantly concentrated in the European region, particularly around the vibrant city of Moscow and the enchanting St. Petersburg. These cities, renowned for their cultural and economic significance, exude breathtaking beauty. However, the influence of Russians extends far into Asia as well. Throughout history, waves of Russian settlers and Russian-speaking individuals migrated eastward, populating thriving cities like Vladivostok and Irkutsk in Siberia. Russia's climate is characterized by its extreme nature, particularly its harsh and unforgiving winters, which have famously served as a formidable defense against foreign invaders. While the climatic conditions present daily challenges, the land itself is a generous provider, offering abundant crops and valuable resources such as vast reserves of oil, gas, and precious metals. However, the wealth derived from these resources has not translated into an easy life for the majority of the population. Throughout Russia's history, a recurring theme emerges, portraying a stark contrast between the affluent and powerful ruling elite and the impoverished and powerless masses. This narrative of social inequality and disparity has persisted, with serfdom enduring until relatively recent times. The era of Soviet communist rule, particularly under the long dictatorship of Joseph Stalin, introduced a different form of subjugation that demanded strict conformity and exacting obedience from the population. Russia's history, therefore, tells a somber tale of the few wielding power and wealth while the majority grapples with a challenging existence. The Russian Republic emerged after the 1917 revolution and later became a Union Republic in 1922. Throughout the post-World War II era, Russia played a significant role in global affairs, engaged in a Cold War rivalry with the United States. Following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia joined other former Soviet republics to establish the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. While transitioning away from communism brought changes and the potential for Russia to reclaim its world power status, the post-communist era presented challenges such as a weak economy, high inflation, and social problems affecting life expectancy. Russia has a rich history of excellence in arts and sciences. Renowned figures like Chekhov, Pushkin, Tolstoy, Gogol, Dostoevsky, and Tchaikovsky emerged from pre-revolutionary Russian society. The 1917 revolution influenced the works of Gorky, Pasternak, Solzhenitsyn, Shostakovich, and Prokofiev. In the late Soviet and post-communist periods, interest in once forbidden artists like Mayakovsky and Akhmatova resurged, and new talents like Pelevin and Tolstoy emerged. Their works reflect the resilience and strength of the Russian people. History of relationship between Russia and Ukraine. Russia-Ukraine relations. Ukraine's independence from the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of 70 years of totalitarian rule. The country had endured a series of hardships, including civil war, famine, Nazi occupation, and political oppression. The Soviet Union, dominated by Russia, treated Ukraine as a subordinate region, with Ukrainian culture and language marginalized in favor of Russian. Ukraine's relationship with Moscow resembled a colonial dynamic, as its resources and population were exploited for the benefit of the Russian ruling class. At the time of independence, Ukraine faced the challenge of nation-building without a strong tradition of statecraft, while maintaining significant economic and cultural ties with Russia. Since gaining independence, Ukraine has sought to shape its future in Europe, while Russia has sought to impede this direction. The struggle between Ukraine's aspirations for a new path and Russia's opposition has been a central theme in contemporary Ukrainian history. Ukraine-Russia relation. When Ukraine declared independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, it had endured significant challenges throughout its history. It experienced a civil war during the Bolshevik Revolution, a devastating famine in the 1930s, brutal Nazi occupation during World War II, and political oppression in subsequent decades. Under Soviet rule, Ukraine was heavily influenced by Russia, with the Ukrainian Communist Party serving as a puppet to Moscow. Russian was prioritized over Ukrainian in areas like science, politics, administration, and urban centers. Ukrainian cultural and political elites either faced suppression or migrated to Moscow to serve the Soviet administration. Ukraine, like other Soviet republics, was effectively controlled by Moscow, continuing a relationship that began during the pre-revolutionary era of Tsarist Imperial Russia. Its resources and population were exploited for the benefit of the ruling Russian class. As a result of this tumultuous history, Ukraine faced significant challenges when it gained independence. It lacked a strong tradition of independent governance and had deep-rooted ties with Russia in terms of energy, trade, and culture, despite the collapse of the political union. Since gaining independence, Ukraine has been striving to define its own future, particularly in relation to Europe, while encountering resistance from Russia, which seeks to impede its desired direction. A short history of Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine faced significant hardships under the rule of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. The policies implemented by Stalin, such as his attacks on land ownership and forced collectivization of agriculture, disproportionately affected Ukrainian-speaking peasants. This led to a devastating famine in the early 1930s, resulting in the loss of millions of lives. During World War II, Ukraine was invaded by Nazi forces and subjected to a horrific Holocaust. The war took a heavy toll on Ukraine, with millions of Ukrainians losing their lives, including a significant number of Ukrainian Jews who were executed by Nazi death squads. After the war, Ukraine had a nominal form of independence within the Soviet Union and held a founding member status in the United Nations. However, in reality, Ukraine was directly governed by the Communist Party in Moscow. It became a hub for the Soviet arms industry and housed a large portion of the nuclear arsenal. The 1986 Chernobyl disaster further fueled public outrage among Ukrainians, exposing the secretive and inhumane handling of the incident. Despite the oppressive regime, Ukraine had a strong dissident movement that fought for human rights and freedom. Ukraine played a crucial role in advocating for the implementation of these principles as outlined in the Helsinki Accords of 1976, which eventually contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev, the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, attempted to redefine the country through negotiations and reforms. However, his efforts were met with opposition from Ukrainian protesters and the emerging National Democratic Opposition, who sought greater autonomy, especially after the Chernobyl disaster. Gorbachev's reforms, known as perestroika, reconstruction, and glasnost, openness, aimed to revitalize the country after years of stagnation. However, they inadvertently accelerated the collapse and breakup of the Soviet Union. In 1991, a coup attempt against Gorbachev by Russian leaders failed, weakening his position. Meanwhile, Boris Yeltsin emerged as a prominent leader in Moscow. With the political situation in Russia in disarray, Ukraine seized the opportunity and declared its independence. When did Ukraine leave the Soviet Union? In August 1991, Ukraine boldly declared its independence. This declaration was officially ratified by a referendum in early December, receiving an overwhelming 90% yes vote. Leonid Kravchuk was elected as the first president of independent Ukraine. Notably, this was the same month when Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev resigned and the Soviet Union dissolved itself. The initial period following Ukraine's independence was filled with a sense of euphoria. The transition to independence had been remarkably peaceful, with both communist and democratic factions agreeing to separate, driven in large part by the anticipated economic potential of the country. The United States was somewhat taken aback by Ukraine's resolute stance on independence. Nevertheless, due to Ukraine's possession of a substantial Soviet nuclear arsenal, close engagement with the country was necessary. In 1994, The Budapest Memorandum was established, outlining Ukraine's commitment to disarmament. In return, the US, Russia, UK, and France provided security assurances to safeguard Ukrainian territorial integrity. However, Ukraine faced significant challenges in the 1990s as its Soviet-style planned economy crumbled. The country endured widespread economic hardships, including shortages, blackouts, inflation, and a surge in immigration. Additionally, corruption and cronyism plagued the nation, further exacerbating its difficulties. From 2004 to 2007, Ukraine experienced a notable increase in economic prosperity, coinciding with a growing demand for greater democracy and human rights. All about conflict. The Ukraine-Russia conflict explained. The current conflict in Ukraine can be traced back to Russia's long-standing desire to exert control over its neighboring regions, a goal that became particularly evident when Vladimir Putin assumed power in 2000. Putin aimed to maintain a strong economic and political hold on Ukraine, employing initially subtle forms of coercion which later evolved into more assertive and aggressive tactics. The turning point came with the Orange Revolution in 2004, when Putin had to reassess his approach. His preferred candidate for the Ukrainian presidency, Viktor Yanukovych, was ousted through a democratic vote following allegations of election fraud. Viktor Yushchenko, a pro-Western opposition candidate, assumed power after surviving a poisoning attempt during the electoral campaign. Russia faced widespread blame for the incident. Despite these changes, Russia maintained a grip on vital sectors within Ukraine. The majority of Ukraine's exports were still directed towards Russia. Key security positions were held by individuals with Russian citizenship, and the country remained heavily reliant on Russian gas. A disadvantageous gas deal signed in 2008 committed Ukraine to purchasing Russian gas at prices above the market rate. Russian cultural dominance was also evident in the media and cultural sphere, while support for Ukrainian language and culture from the state remained inadequate. Until 2018, Ukraine lacked an independent Orthodox Church, as the Russian Orthodox Church held complete jurisdiction over Ukrainian territories, with a significant number of parishes in Ukraine compared to Russia. Furthermore, the Russian Navy's Black Sea Fleet maintained its base in Crimea, secured by a 2010 agreement ensuring its presence for decades. Ukraine's constitution included a provision of neutrality, imposed at Russia's insistence, which prevented Ukraine from pursuing NATO membership. However, the public demand for closer integration with the European Union (EU) grew, putting pressure on Ukrainian presidents, including Yanukovych, to respond. The EU presented more favorable economic prospects and a commitment to human rights compared to maintaining ties with Russia. In an effort to thwart Ukraine's path towards EU membership, Russia escalated its hostile rhetoric towards both the EU and NATO. The annexation of Crimea. The path towards annexation began when Ukraine sought to strengthen its political and trade ties with the European Union, EU. Viktor Yanukovych, who had returned to power and become the Ukrainian president in 2010, faced pressure from Putin to reject a new association and trade agreement with the EU that had been negotiated over a period of 7 years. Russia applied significant pressure on Yanukovych, imposing trade sanctions that banned the import of Ukrainian goods and their transit through Russian territory to China. Additionally, Russia stoked unrest in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, posing a threat to Ukraine's security. Under this pressure, Yanukovych agreed to postpone the EU agreement. However, this decision sparked the Euromaidan protests in 2013, with the Ukrainian people taking to the streets to voice their dissent. Putin had not anticipated such a strong popular reaction, as he viewed the EU agreement as merely a bureaucratic trade document. He also underestimated the determination of the protesters to persist in their demands. To the Ukrainian people, this moment represented a critical choice for their country: to remain tied to autocratic Russia or to embrace the principles of rule-based Europe. In the final days of the protests, over 100 people were shot by police snipers on the streets of Kyiv. Yanukovych lost all legitimacy, support from ruling elites, and even his own political party. Fleeing to Russia in February 2014, His departure prompted Putin to orchestrate a military takeover of the strategic Crimean Peninsula. When did Russia invade Ukraine? Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine took place in February and March 2014, when it annexed Crimea. Seizing the opportunity when Ukraine was vulnerable with a temporary government and ill-prepared military, Putin deployed 30,000 troops without insignia to take control of regional infrastructure. A referendum was then staged to legitimize the occupation. Despite Western urging for Ukraine to avoid responding with force, the situation escalated. In order to divert international attention from the bloodless takeover of Crimea, Russia swiftly moved to strike in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. Russian special forces, supported by local militias, declared independent People's Republics, leading to open military conflict with the Ukrainian armed forces. During this time, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was tragically shot down by a Russia-supplied surface-to-air missile operated by pro-Russia separatists. This incident resulted in the loss of almost 300 lives. Between 2014 and 2021, the conflict took a heavy toll on Ukraine, costing the country over $10 billion, causing 14,000 deaths, and leaving Donbas as the most landmined area in Europe. Putin's aim was to gradually force Ukraine into making concessions through a prolonged, low-intensity conflict. Russia participated in diplomatic efforts such as the Minsk agreements, but its demands for unique powers and autonomous status for the Donbas region were met with opposition. Over time, key diplomatic players shifted their support to Kyiv's interpretation of the Minsk agreement, standing against Russia's actions, which aimed to weaken Ukraine and keep it under Russian dominance. Putin realized that his strategy was failing as Ukraine continued integrating with the EU and resisting the Russian vision of a settlement. In February 2022, Putin ordered a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, launching attacks from Donbas, Crimea, and neighboring Belarus. However, Ukrainian resistance proved prepared, organized, and effective. President Zelensky, elected in 2019, garnered strong public approval for his leadership during the conflict, and the entire nation mobilized against the invading forces. Pro-Russian elements within Ukraine did not collaborate as anticipated, exposing Putin's hopes as mere fantasy. Russia's military advances were halted, and the Kremlin failed to achieve any strategic objectives after a month of campaigning. Ukraine's resilience inspired action from NATO, the EU, and the US, resulting in unprecedented economic sanctions against Russia and support for Ukraine through arms, economic aid, and humanitarian assistance. What does Russia want from Ukraine? Russia's motivations in its conflict with Ukraine can be traced to three primary objectives, all of which are strongly influenced by domestic factors. Firstly, Russia perceives Ukraine as belonging to its sphere of influence, considering it a territory rather than an independent state. Russia views Ukraine and Belarus, as former Soviet Union states, as part of a historic triune nation with Russia. Putin initiated the war in an attempt to dismantle Ukraine's nation-building project and restore a vision of a historical Russia, based on borders prior to 1917. The Ukrainian desire to break away from Russian influence is seen as a direct attack on Russia's sovereignty, which fuels a strong sense of entitlement within the Kremlin. This belief drives Russia's efforts to impede Ukraine's integration with Euro-Atlantic structures. Initially, Russia aimed to use the conflict in Donbas to keep Ukraine unstable, weak, and unattractive for Western investments, while preventing its membership in collective security alliances, particularly NATO. However, the 2022 invasion marked a strategic shift, as Russia sought to subjugate Ukraine through the use of force. Nonetheless, this move appears to have been a significant miscalculation. Secondly, Putin aims to consolidate his autocratic rule within Russia. He seeks to prevent the emergence of an alternative democratic system of governance on Russia's border. A defeated and compliant Ukraine serves as a lesson to ordinary Russians, reinforcing the notion that revolution leads to disaster. A failed Ukraine acts as an antidote to democratic sentiments within Russia, where memories of the chaotic aftermath of the Soviet collapse remain potent. Thirdly, Putin utilizes Ukraine to support a broader narrative of Russia being a fortress under siege by the West, requiring a strong commander-in-chief to protect its civilization. In Russian media, the war in Ukraine is portrayed as a special operation, in response to a Western project aimed at undermining Russia's interests. Overall, Russia's actions in Ukraine are driven by a combination of territorial ambitions, domestic political considerations, and the need to cultivate a narrative of a threatened Russia in order to maintain control domestically and deter Western influence. All about political decisions and alliances that influenced the conflict. Europe found itself in the midst of a major war after years of an underlying conflict, resulting in a complex political landscape. Nations aligned with either Putin's Russia, pledged support to Ukraine, or adopted a non-aligned stance to avoid involvement or mitigate risks. The European Union, EU, reacted swiftly to the outbreak of war, imposing substantial sanctions and taking action against Russia. Despite some disagreements within the bloc, such as varying positions on the oil price cap and Germany's reluctance to provide certain military resources, the EU mostly remained united. This surprised Russia, as the EU showcased unexpected resolve and cohesion in its response, according to Pepijn Bergson from Chatham House. The United Kingdom emphasized its close relationship with Kyiv and sought to lead the international response with strong rhetoric and military support. Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson's actions were seen as an opportunistic way to promote the UK's post-Brexit, Global Britain, credentials, as noted by John Campner, the director of Chatham House's UK in the World Initiative. However, support for Ukraine was less widespread in other regions. As expected, Putin called upon old allies like Syria's Bashar al-Assad and Belarus's Alexander Lukashenko, while also strengthening ties with Iran. Shortly after the invasion, a UN General Assembly resolution condemning Russia's aggression was passed with an overwhelming majority. Nevertheless, there were 35 abstentions, including South Africa, Pakistan, and India from the Commonwealth. In Asia, only a few governments, such as Singapore, South Korea, and Japan, stood strongly with Ukraine. The major rising powers in the region, including China, India, and Indonesia, refused to take a definitive side. This rejection of Western framings of the conflict as a battle between might and right demonstrates Asia's pragmatic approach, with nations maintaining relationships with Russia for various economic, military, and diplomatic reasons, as explained by Ben Bland of Chatham House. Similar trends were observed in Africa, where a significant percentage of abstentions condemning Russia's invasion came from African countries. Dr. Alex Vines, Chatham House's Africa Program Director, highlighted that non-alignment was more comfortable for many African nations than aligning with either the Western or Eastern positions. Dr. Vines advocated for a position of multipolarity, which would grant them more agency instead of being forced to choose between democratic and autocratic superpowers. Iran took advantage of tactical and strategic deals, providing support to Russia in bypassing sanctions and supplying attack drones. In return, Moscow aided Tehran in suppressing domestic protests by providing surveillance capabilities. Turkey emerged as a significant diplomatic player, bridging gaps between various parties. It played a role in brokering grain blockade deals, acted as a humanitarian base for hostage swaps, and hosted peace talks, which, thus far, have not yielded success. Simultaneously, Turkey blocked the NATO accession of Finland and Sweden for its own security reasons. In summary, the outbreak of a major war in Europe led to a diverse political landscape, with nations aligning with Russia, supporting Ukraine, or maintaining non-alignment. The EU responded with sanctions, while the UK emphasized its relationship with Ukraine. Support for Ukraine varied globally, with Asian and African nations adopting pragmatic approaches. Iran took advantage of the situation through strategic deals, and Turkey emerged as a crucial diplomatic player. Here we comes to the end of. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in next video.